Hey everyone, I think I'm Ash, and this is a video demo of some new functionality being added to Benthos Studio called deployments. And the purpose of deployments is to allow you to use Benthos Studio as a configuration management tool, as well as the place that you might create and edit Benthos configs. And what you can do is you can deploy Benthos instances in your own infrastructure still. You still own where Benthos is running and where your data exists, but you point those instances to Benthos Studio, and you can use Benthos Studio to control which configs are being run. You can update those configs, and you can also have multiple different pipelines configured and choose what the distribution of them is. So say one should be run twice as much as another, and then rather than managing that in your deployments, you can just deploy any number of Benthos instances, and Studio will control which configs are being run and manage all those things. The Benthos instances will just continuously sync up with what you're setting up in Studio. So hopefully it's going to make deployments a little bit easier for people who make frequent changes to their configs, and they want something that's going to be a little bit more easy to manage than, say, config maps and Kubernetes and stuff like that. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to be putting together a little architecture where we're using NATS PubSub as the streaming backbone. I'm going to be generating a bunch of data, writing that into a subject, and then I'm going to use Benthos Studio to configure two different Benthos instances that are each going to read from a NATS subject, and then they're going to enrich the data by hitting one of two HTTP servers. They're each going to hit a different one, and then they're going to write that data back to a new NATS subject. And it's just going to be a bit of fun, just a bit of a laugh in it. And if you want to run this demo yourself as I'm doing it, then you're welcome to. The configs for the NAT server, the HTTP server endpoints, and the data generator, those are all Kubernetes configs that I've added to the Benthos repo. So there'll be a link in the description. I'm just using Minikube to run this stuff. So it's fairly straightforward to follow along if you would like to do that, but you don't have to. If you want to just sit back and enjoy the show, then you can do that as well. I'm gonna be here, so I'll be able to explain what's happening in the demo as it happens. So don't freak out if you're thinking, "Oh, I wasn't ready to set up a whole architecture today. I just wanted to watch a YouTube video." You're still being accounted for. Okay, so to start off with, I've got the Benthos repo open here. The folder resources contains a bunch of demos and useful scripts and configs and things. And in the Kubernetes one, there's only one demo right now called NATS and Studio, but this is all the stuff that we're going to be running as part of this demo. You don't need to understand Kubernetes. Don't worry about that. I'm just using it as an example of some way of deploying all this stuff, but I will run Benthos locally. So you'll get to see Benthos interacting with Studio on my machine without all the obfuscation of Kubernetes. It's just a convenient way of me running NATS and all these other services we're going to be hooking up with. And I'm going to be doing this locally with Minikube, just on my local machine. So, right, we've got this README in here, which just lists all the stuff. We've got a bunch of Kubernetes configs, the main one being NATS. I'm just going to start running all this stuff. So we're going to apply NATS. We want to run NATS. This is the backbone of our demo. We're also going to have this Benthos generator running. So this is what's going to be generating our example data. You can actually look at the config here. It's very, very simple. It's just a generate input, creates data with a field ID, which is just a UUID. And then we're writing out to our NATS at the subject demo-a. So that's going to be running. We're also going to run this Benthos server thing. And this is just an example like enrichment services. It's just to make our configs a little bit more interesting in this demo. But this is just an HTTP server. We have an HTTP server input and then a sync response output. So you'll be posting data at the path/test. And if your path is /test/a, then we run this mapping. And if it's /test/b, we run this mapping. And then we return that back as a sync response. I could have done a Python script for this or use some other tool, but I'm the Benthos guy, so I'm going to use Benthos to do this. But yeah, we're going to have that running in the background as well. And that's basically it for now. kubectl get pods, just to make sure they're all running. Yep, they're all running. And the first time I'm going to be running my Studio deployments, I'm going to be doing it on the local machine, so I want to be able to connect to the services within Kubernetes. So for that, I'm going to need to do some port forwarding. So I'm just going to paste these commands, run them in the background. We've got port forward service nats, and then 4222, and then we're doing the same with our Benthos server thing. I'll do that in the foreground because we're basically done with this now. This little CLI. Actually, no, I'll tell you what, I will do that. I will do that in the background. Get back there. And that's it for now. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff in this demo. So let's get to Benthos Studio, the interesting bit. The first thing we're going to need to do is create a session. Ignore these sessions that I already have here. These are my private business. Leave them alone. So I'm going to call this deployment demo and stuff because I don't want to rule anything out. And that's it. We just got an empty session, no config files. So the first file I'm going to make is, let's call this demo A. I need to come up with better names for stuff, but this is going to be a config where we're reading from that demo-a subject in nats, and then we're going to do some stuff with that stream. So I'm going to make a nats input, add a URL. Here's one I made earlier. Subject, here's one I made earlier. So those are the only two fields that we need. We need a URL and a subject. And then that's good to go. And just to prove that we are running this config, I'm going to add a mutation that says root. We're going to add a new field called really. And I'm just going to populate that with the literal string yep. Submit. Now, traditionally in Benthos Studio, if you wanted to see the flow of messages in your config, you would have to mock this input because it's not going to run it for you. So you do this by creating a mock, and let's just make a JSON field that looks kind of like what we would expect. Some junk like that. Submit. So now we can see that events are running through the config in this sort of mocked way. And we can see that our new field really yep is there. That's all good, that's all happy, but it's not great because we're not seeing data that's actually coming from nats. Ideally we would, and that's something we're going to actually see for our very own eyes in this demo at some point. So right, I've got a config that I can run. The next thing to do is create a deployment. So what a deployment is it's essentially an instruction of in this session, here is a config that should be executed. And the reason why we define a deployment and you don't just run everything inside the session is because a single session, there's no reason why you couldn't have multiple configs in there if that's how you want to organize things. And another thing you can do with the session is you can actually have multiple deployments and distribute those across all the Benthos instances that are running the session deployments. So when you run Benthos against a session, you just point it to the session itself and it will be allocated a deployment. So there's nothing stopping from having multiple configs and multiple deployments, which we will see in this demo at some point. But for now, I'm just going to make a foo deployment, and the main config to deploy is demo A. If you had resources, so if you've broken your configs down into resources, in this window you'd also be able to specify which files you want to import as resource files, but since we only have one file here, it hasn't bothered showing that. And the first thing we get is a little warning saying, hey, nothing's going to be able to run this, bruh, because you need to generate a node token. So that's the way that authentication works with the Benthos instances that are running your session. You create a node token which you can revoke at any time if it becomes compromised. So that's what we're going to do next. So we've got this deployment listed here that I can just enable and disable this arbitrarily. And the idea is that Benthos instances that are running this session now would be allocated this deployment. And if I disable it, they will actually stop running the config. If there's nothing else to run, they'll kind of report that periodically to say, hey, you told me to run the session, but there's nothing enabled. But yeah, if you've noticed something's bad, then you can just quickly stop it. And yeah, let's generate a node token then. So this is the thing that's going to allow our Benthos instances to connect to the session. I'm going to be doing this offline and then uploading the video after I've deleted the token that's generated here. So don't try and hack me, please. Well, you can try and hack me. Come at me, basically. I'm just going to call this test token because my brain Can't really do anything else. And then what comes up is this window. So this is the only time you're ever going to be able to see the token ID and the secret. Because Benthos itself, the studio doesn't keep this for you. It just keeps a hashed sorted version of it. So if you ever want to, if you lose this secret in the future, you would have to generate a new token. And what we have underneath that down here is just a bunch of example configs showing you how to use these secrets and run Benthos against Benthos Studio. So I'm actually going to use this now. So the different options we've got are local, Docker, Docker Compose, Kubernetes. Obviously, you're not limited to those options. These are just the ones that we have examples for. There's two different ways of running it locally. You can either specify the token and token secret as CLI args, as just flags, or you can define environment variables and use that. This is the better approach, I would say. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to create studio.env, where my secret and token live. And then what I can do is I can execute this command benthos pull, and this will do the thing. And hopefully it'll work. So that's worked. What's happened is this Benthos instance has come alive, and we've told it to run a Benthos Studio session with the studio pull command. And we specified our session ID here. And what's happening is it's periodically syncing up with the session to see if any config changes have been made. And while that's happening in the background, it's actually running the config continuously. So all of our test data is coming through, and we're adding this field really. Yep. And it looks good. One other thing I'm going to do, so this is how you would run it locally, but I'm also going to be running it on Kubernetes in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure I've copied the secret and token as a secret within Kubernetes. So the recommended approach here is to use the create secret command and just put your things in there. So now that's been created as a Kubernetes resource. So in the future, I'll be able to do a Kubernetes deployment that uses those secrets. And now that I've saved that, I can close this. If you want to be reminded as to the different deployment methods and you've closed that token window, you can just click this link underneath your deployments and they all exist here. Well, you don't get those. You obviously don't get the secret and token printed, but you just get these to-dos. Right. Now this is interesting, obviously, running this thing, but I'm going to make it more interestinger. And I'm going to run this extra CLI arg. So if you run help against the Benthos Studio command, let me just minimize this so you can see it. There's an extra flag for the Studio pull command called send traces. And what that does is it means that when a Benthos instance is running your session, what it can do is it can report back what data is doing as it travels through your config, and then you can actually see that populated within the visual editor. So I'm going to add this flag to the command I was running before. So we've got this Benthos e studio pull command, and I'm going to add send traces. And it's just going to do the same thing as it was before. It's just adding this really yep thing. So if I open this window now, what will happen is eventually those traces will be populated in this view. So for example, I can go to run events. And here we go. So what we're seeing is a live feed of the traces coming back from this instance. So I can see that there's some metadata on these messages, which is the NAT subject, and then I can see the contents of the data. And what's happening is we're reading things and we're adding this really yet field. I can also just click on the NATS input itself and I can just see the data as it came in. This mock is still happening, so we're still running the config. I can actually just remove that now because I don't want it. It's just adding noise to the UI. But yeah, so I can now make changes to this config, and what's going to happen is the Benthos instances that are running it will refresh and update, and then I should be able to see the changes happening. So I can change this mutation, for example. So I can just put really nope, submit that, and as you can see, the config got refreshed. So now we're actually running that config here. And hopefully when I open up my run events, I can see the new behavior. So we're getting this really nope thing. So I hope you'll agree that's cool. Wow, that's awesome. What else can we do with it? Well, let's integrate this with the other services that I was running. So we're obviously hitting NATs. Let's write more data out to NATs rather than standard out. So the first thing I'm going to do is localhost, and then we're going to create this new subject demo B. I think those are the only fields I need to populate. So now what should happen is, rather than writing data to standard out, when the config gets refreshed, we're just going to write to this new subject, and that's exactly what's happening. And don't fret, because we're sending traces back, we can still see what's happening here, so we haven't lost visibility as to what's going on in the background. And what else are we going to do? I'm going to add an HTTP processor that's going to hit localhost, and we have this, what was the config? I need to refresh my mind. It's /test, and then we've got /a and /b endpoints. So let's hit one of these. So test and then /a. I'm going to do a post. So if I hit that endpoint now with these new configs, hopefully that should all work. We've synced, and now the process has been executed. And yeah, there we go. So we're hitting endpoint /a. So if you look at the config we've got for this Benthos server deployment, if you hit test A, what we do in response is we uppercase the content and just send it back. So now our JSON payload is uppercase. We've also got this new metadata that you can see. That's cool, isn't it? So that's an interesting config, isn't it? That's really interesting. I'm going to make another one now. I'm actually just going to copy this. Let's make a demo B to our deployment demo. Refresh the page. So we've now got demo B. Now I'm going to make basically the same config, but I'm going to hit the endpoint B instead. Now this is in the same state that we were at before we were running the sessions, where because it's not being executed by a deployment, it's just not going to, we're not going to see anything in the UI unless we mock the data. I'm actually going to create a new deployment called bar, which executes demo B, and I'm going to run another Benthos Studio command. Let's just refresh my mind as to how that works. I'm going to do that in a new tab. I'm also going to add the send traces because I still want to send traces. We did have an HTTP server error, but we're going to ignore that. And that's running now. So we have 2 Benthos instances, each running deployments against the session. And what we can see is we've got 2 connected nodes, and they've each been given one of the deployments. And that's because they fan out. And you'll notice when I was creating these deployments that there's this weight field. And that is essentially an integer that determines the weight of the deployment as it's getting fanned out. So for example, if you want one config to be run twice as many times as another one, you could give it double the weight. And it just gives you a way of kind of tuning how many nodes get assigned to all the different deployments. For free plans right now, you can only have 1 deployment per session. But I am planning to let people upgrade their accounts and get more deployments if they want. Now, as these are running, we're obviously getting the traces back, as I was showing you. So, for example, when we're hitting the new endpoint, it's rather than uppercasing, this one does the and this edit to the data. But the other thing we can do is we can actually click on the deployments themselves, and we get a bit of information back. So we have metrics, and this is just useful for getting a general feel. I'm going to slowly add more and more info to this. So I might add logs, for example, and some of the data if you've opted into it. The only thing that comes by default is metrics because it's fairly harmless to send that back, to report that back. And all this is there's a few dashboards. So there's consumed versus produced. And as you can see, they both match up right now because we're not doing any filtering or anything like that. And then there's also consumed by labels. So for example, if you had labeled components, you'd be able to break down the metrics by that. And then there's also process versus errors. So we're not getting any errors in our processes. So it's a very simple graph. And it tells you things like the uptime. It shows you how many nodes are connected, and you can filter the metrics by specific nodes. Things like that. So I'm going to slowly add more and more info here, and what you'll be able to do is essentially use Benthos Studio as just a kind of high level overview of what your deployments are doing.
Oh, hello. I just wanted to add here that just because you're using Benthos Studio to manage your configurations doesn't mean that you don't still get all the typical observability goodies that you get from a normal Benthos deployment. So for example, you can still use Prometheus scraping for your metrics, and you can still configure Jaeger distributed tracing, etc. The things that you see in Benthos Studio, those are extra things that you get on top, so you don't miss out on any of the normal observability goodies.
And then obviously I can enable and disable these on a whim. So for example, if I disable the bar config, what's eventually going to happen is both nodes are going to rebalance, and we can have both of them running the only remaining deployment. But let's put it back on because I feel bad for it. So those are all the major important features of Studio deployments. So what I'm going to do next is just show you how cool this is for things like Kubernetes deployments, where you can just quickly scale up the number of nodes and distribute them, and kind of use Studio as the source of truth for what's currently being executed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop running these two local instances. I'm going to wind those down, and I'm going to change the weight. So currently you can't actually edit the weight of an active deployment, so I'm just going to redo bar. I will fix this eventually, I promise. But I'm going to make it so that we have twice the number of bars as we have foos. And then I'm going to have a little look at so I've got in this Natson Studio demo, I have a Benthos Studio node config. So this is one way of executing Benthos instances against a Studio session with Kubernetes. So I'm using environment variables to inject my secrets. And one thing you have to do is you have to populate the session ID here. So to get the session ID, you can obviously see it in these configs, but it's up here as well. And once I've pasted this in, whoops, I'll save that, and I think that's all good to go. Now one thing I've done is I've listed replicas 10 here. Also I'm going to stop, actually no, I'll leave my services port forwarding in the background. So I've got replicas 10 listed here, so that means we're going to create 10 nodes. And I think other than that, that's pretty much all you would need to modify here. The command is Benthos Studio pull. I haven't specified send traces here. We can add that, but let's not. Can't be bothered. And yeah, that's it. I think we're good to go. So kubectl apply f and then Benthos Studio node, and hopefully this will do a bunch of stuff. What is good. So if I get the pods, we can see they are creating, some of them are running. Okay, they're all running now. Let's go back to Studio and see what happened. Cool, okay, so we have 6 nodes connected to our bar and 4 nodes connected to our foo because they're not perfectly divisible by 3. And that all looks good at a glance, but just to get a glimpse of what's actually happening internally, I'm just going to copy one of these configs and I'm going to run locally a Benthos instance that's going to yank, we'll call it yank yank the data out of that demo B subject. Oh, my typing is off today. So demo B, and let's execute that. And what we should hopefully see is messages coming through. And they're not. Haha! Okay, they're not. Because there are errors. Now, if I look on the graph, we should actually see that nothing's being produced. So nothing's being produced. We can see that the data flow went way down. And the reason for that, so if I had traces on, we'd be able to see. And if I had the logs showing, then we would see. If I get the logs from one of these pods, yeah, I can see failed to connect to NATs. So the reason for that is my configs are bad. So let's fix that. So in my demo A, demo B configs, the reason why we're not getting any data is because I'm trying to connect to localhost from within Kubernetes. In actual fact, the host name is nats in my particular configs. So we're going to change all of these to nats. Do the same with this one. And then what should happen is if we wait, if we give it a minute, we should start seeing data coming through. So, yeah, here we go. So the Kubernetes deployments, they will have automatically refreshed the configs, and now we're actually getting data back. And hey, it's me in the future now. So what I did is I just left all the stuff running and did a bit of toggling of enabling, disabling different deployments just to make the graphs look a little bit interesting. So now when you look at the consume versus produce graphs of both these deployments, there's a bit of a squiggle there. Just to make things interesting for you. I've also rotated some of the nodes. So when you have nodes spin up, you can choose to give them a name, and they become more like a pet. Or you can just let them generate their own name. If you let them generate their own name, every time the instances get restarted or torn up and torn back down again, etc., every time they get rotated, they have a new ID. Now, the IDs are useful for tracking the individual nodes if you want to look at their specific graphs. So, for example, you might find that one node in particular struggled to connect and had problems, and you can break down the graphs by that particular node. But also, there's a bit of a cache for previously connected nodes. So you'll see a list that shows you things that used to be connected to a deployment and they no longer are. And you can look at their graphs in particular. You can also select multiple. But whatever, I just want to show you that. There is another issue that we need to resolve. So as you may be aware, there's two problems with this stream that we're getting out. Firstly, we're getting duplicate data, and that's because the configs, the inputs that we're using, we don't have a queue. So the messages in demo A are getting fanned out to everything that's connected. Now, obviously in a Kubernetes world where we're scaling the nodes up, we obviously don't want that, so I'm going to play around with adding a queue. So we're going to have QA and QB because I do want to fan out to the different configs, but I want the nodes executing a given config to round robin essentially. So we'll set demo A to QA, and we'll set demo B to QB. Let's see. So we are now seeing just two messages showing up for each ID. So that's good. That's what we want. And then the next thing I need to fix is the fact that we're not actually hitting our enrichments. And that's because the HTTP processor is doing the same thing that our NATS inputs and outputs were doing, which is they're hitting localhost, which doesn't work in the Kubernetes environment. The particular host name we're going to need is... what is the deployment called? for our server, it's just Benthos server. So that's what we need to set these to. Benthos server. Let's fix one of these, but not the other. So demo A should see itself get fixed and demo B won't. So yeah, one of our messages is potentially getting enriched. Now all of them are each going to have to individually update their configs, so slowly as we reach consistency, we'll start seeing these uppercase messages become the norm. And then what I'll do is I'll fix demo B as well. And then hopefully as that also refreshes, we'll start seeing the and thises as well. Cool. Right, and that's a wrap. The only other thing that's maybe worth showing is we can actually try and increase the number of replicas of our Benthos Studio nodes. So how about we try and double this to 20 and see what happens. kubectl apply and then Benthos Studio node. And kubectl get pods. So there's a bunch of them getting created now. And they're basically all done. So now if we refresh the page and see how many deployments we've got, now we've got 14 executing bar and 6 executing foo. Right, and that's basically it. That's essentially all I wanted to show in this demo. So hopefully that's been interesting. Hopefully that's been exciting. And maybe I'll see you around for another one of these. Now listen, please look after yourself. I know that the video is over, but that doesn't mean your life is over. That doesn't mean there's no more purpose in this world. You're going to have to figure it out though. I don't know whether that means you watch another one of my videos maybe. Maybe you've already seen them all, in which case you're really screwed. But hey, I'll tell you what you can do. You can like this video and subscribe to the channel. Maybe that'll make you feel a little bit better. Maybe that'll heal your soul.